I would love it if you could just introduce yourself, tell us about your background and kind of how you came to be where you are and what you're doing and that sort of thing.
Perfect. So thanks for the opportunity and the interview. So my name is Debbie Tagg. I have the privilege of being COO of a training and development company called Commerce Edge, but actually where everyone else knows me more in the public domain is the division that I head up, which is called Smart Procurement. So we've been privileged for the last 20 years to almost have a continuous professional development role for the community, for procurement and supply chain professionals, not just here in South Africa, but also up into Africa. And which also means we get involved in a lot of very interesting things. So I mentioned to you, obviously going off to the Sustainability Summit or Sustain in Paris. So whatever is needed for our community and our professionals, we look for partners, we look at best practice. We're also very active in things like benchmarking surveys. So yeah, we do a lot and pretty much work with this very interesting dynamic community of heads of procurement and supply chain. And I know you're going to ask me very specific questions, Alex. I'll answer to the best of my ability. I think what is probably more surprising often, and I don't know, this might just be more of an African thing or South African thing. We think we're quite far behind, South Africa is actually, when you come here, it is almost like a first world country, but we still have a lot of things that we're still developing. But when you travel and you see what's going on outside there, especially as heads of procurement, I think the challenges typically can be the same within organizations. So yeah, that's the privilege that I have.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so today we wanted to talk about sort of digital transformation of procurement, kind of starting with where we're at right now. How would you describe the current state of digital transformation of procurement 2025?
I would say it seemed pretty static. As I said, we do these benchmarking surveys for the last 4 or 5 years, specifically focused on, funny enough, on e-procurement. We have expanded it now. And if I talk almost 5 years ago, well, that's basically 2020, 2021, we still have a very large percentage within South Africa that are still using things like Excel. Your technology adoption is still very much at the low end on the procurement, I say value chain, the procurement role. So, it's invoicing, etc., but it's not the more high level contract management and the more strategic stuff. I can say, we always had this question in the survey, say, how far are you? Are you considering it? We don't even ask that anymore. Everyone is considering it. It is happening. It's just everyone's at different stages and at different budget levels. So I think that's where there's a lot of learning at the moment, because now it's not, 5 years ago, you would say, okay, do I just extend my ERP system, or do I look for a best of breed? Is there a cloud solution? But now AI, which has been around, but now everyone's also going, well, I don't want to take something on now, but am I looking far enough in the future that I'm getting the best solution? So yeah, I think there's a lot more time being taken to build the business case. I always use this example in the South African context. So when I joined this industry 14 years ago, there was one e-procurement company in South Africa that was global, that had placement here. We had one locally developed platform, that was it. Now at our recent event, so we hold this very big event in South Africa, in Johannesburg, we had almost 10. And that's major brands from side of South Africa, not just homegrown. So that normally gives us indicative of the market is ready. I think, and one of the things we're trying to push is also, I was chatting to a gentleman from, I think he was from Namibia or whatever, saying, so I don't really understand AI and e-procurement. You don't, and he heads up a very big organization. But we also don't assume that everyone knows it locally in the continent. Obviously, it depends which countries, because you can't just blanket across Africa. There are different economies, but yeah. So that's kind of the state of things, I would say, for now.
Would you say, so you touched on the fact that COVID was obviously a big driver. How do you feel that things have been moving since then? Has it really kind of slowed down? Is it still kind of on the same trajectory of transformation, or?
Definitely on the same trajectory, if not better. So I think there was knee-jerk in COVID. There are major organizations in the South African industries that have gone through their their technological transformation. So it's great to see, as I said, really big organizations that have adopted specifically procurement technology. I think one of the biggest challenges is that if you rush it too quickly, you have to make sure that your processes are correct before you adopt an e-procurement tool no matter what. A lot of the use cases and the case studies that have been shared by senior leadership in our market has been like, oh, we went in, we were ready, we got signed off, we checked the e-procurement provider or technology came in, and then we realized the processes weren't quite on board. So that is also the advice that we've tried to share out through use cases and case studies, take a step first and first plot out. Obviously, you've got your user adoption, which is a whole nother story, but I don't see it slowing down at all. If anything, it's probably speeding up.
That's exciting to hear. So, yeah, you kind of touched on this just now as well, but what would you see as kind of some of the biggest barriers to change right now? Is it just that the processes aren't quite there and we need to fix that aspect first, or is it people?
That's an interesting question. Again, we've literally got this question in the survey. What are your barriers? And one of them is always budget, and budget always is the highest one. However, for those that are really at the coalface of these kind of tools and technology adoption, that's a lack of understanding within the business, because you cannot be any business right now where you're not looking at technology and not stating that budget figure is almost irrelevant, because you're going to make that spend back a million times over. So I think it's kind of a lack of understanding. I'm very, very curious. We're running our next benchmarking now in the next 2 months to see what that looks like. Look, that being said, and I think I speak globally, everyone is now a little bit cautious and looking at, do we conserve, because they don't know what's happening globally. And I think particularly if you're in procurement and supply chain, you don't know what your day-to-day costs are going to be. But that being said, we also saw organizations that had adopted technology and were right ahead of the game were able to maneuver within tricky times like COVID, because they had quick data. They had quick analysis. And it's something I didn't touch on. I know I'm kind of thinking more from a private sector point of view, but keep in mind, government is one of your biggest spenders across Africa. And I think what is encouraging, unfortunately not as much in South Africa, but definitely in markets like Kenya and Ghana, looking at their governments that are really adopting technology. And that's great, because that minimizes corruption, it creates transparency. So, that's really positive for an economy like Ghana. South Africa, it's very distributed still. I kind of wish National Treasury would just say, all right, guys, you're all on the system, because it takes that human element out of it and probably would create greater impact in service delivery with those kind of budgets and spend.
I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know how familiar you are with kind of the European market as well, but would you compare kind of the movement of change or the speed of change with African government to be similar of a European or American government? Or
Dang it, and I know you're putting me on the spot, but I had picked up that you've got some legislative changes that have been happening within the market. I haven't followed it closely. South Africa itself has also gone through Procurement Act changes. A lot of it is just to streamline where there was differences in various legislations. I don't know how long's a piece of string. It was just interesting to me to start seeing all this content and conversation, because it would come up. I obviously track things, and I think, oh wait, no, this is Europe. This is not South Africa's Procurement Act we're talking about. So I think it does seem to be everyone's grappling. But if you do use technology, which then allows your key resource, your most expensive resource, which is people, to then be able to do the more strategic stuff, then you're only going to be a much better organization. I think South Africa, in many ways, and Africa even, can be ahead of the game in certain public sector things, because we do have interesting dynamics. That means we have to be a little more creative. And it's not to say corruption and those kind of things are not everywhere. It's not just here.
do you see a disconnect between digital strategy and operational execution within procurement teams? Is that something that's a struggle?
It is, it doesn't, not specific to procurement. If you change a technology and a user interface and anything, people don't like change. So, we've also again spent a lot of time sharing case studies and ones that have, got the war wounds, and they literally look, I've met a lot of our heads of procurement while they're going through this process and, moving into big systems, and they look a bit shell shocked for about 18 months. and then they sort of crawl out the other end. But the most difficult is getting the team on board, having, captains of change that push it. So yes, there's definitely, and the reality is, and I can't compare overseas or whatever, there's also, if I look at certain age gap, those that are in the market at the moment, in terms of what they learned, were exposed to, studied. I mean, I know personally love technology and playing around, but that's not everyone. And if you're quite kind of an administrative, you don't automatically adopt to this strategic thinking and how can the system help me as ChatGPT. I mean, we actually presented, my gosh, probably 3 years ago at a procurement conference, all government attendees, about 300. We did a show of hands, like, who knows what ChatGPT is? And I think 5 people put up their hand. So we actually did a demo. And then I'd say that to you, you think, 3 years ago, what? So I think there's definitely a disconnect. You've also got to take a step further back and say, well, where's the training happening? Whether it's through, formal training, universities, private universities, whatever, even on the job exposure. And of course, leadership is even a much older generation that's also not being exposed. So yeah, I think it's an opportunity for the up and coming. It's an opportunity for capacity building and competency building. But we also, I always think as a South African market, we have the opportunity to look globally and go, okay, you've gone through the hot toil, and then we can just take the best practice.
So you also point out specifically the leadership. How much of that responsibility for digital improvements do you think falls on the leadership versus their teams?
Sure, I think it depends on the size of the organization. I mean, procurement teams generally are very lean. They're not top heavy. So when you say leadership, it is, I look at large organizations that used to have 200 procurement staff, they may be down to 90, which means, and then your actual leadership, you probably have a head of procurement and maybe 3 category managers or indirect sourcing, whatever. So it's generally quite 3 or 4. That's not a lot. And then, of course, they've got a lot of work to do around with the CFO and CEO. It helps when there's a carrot or a stick scenario. I actually think what's happening overseas is also another burning issue that says we need to know quickly, we need information, we need alternatives, and you can't be doing those things on gut feel.
As you've touched on, we definitely have some growing concern over tariffs and different trade policies happening globally. How should procurement teams specifically try to prepare for this volatility?
I wish I was reading the articles in more depth. There's a lot of opinion at the moment. So at the moment, I'm going to say I don't have the answer. I definitely think please go to smartprocurement.co. And there's an amazing article by actually our MD who's just written on that, especially from a supply chain perspective. But also how you would have to consider your total cost of not ownership but landing now. So TCL, which is honestly a new term for me to get my head around. So look, everyone says it's going to drive. I mean, I'm not talking about exports, and let's just talk about imports at this juncture. I suppose it depends where you're majority importing from. So I know that's a question we've actually asked to our region. And look, majority are coming from your BRIC countries, China always. I don't think we import as much as we think. We don't import that much, but it's going to be our exports that I think is really the problem. So your supply chain, not go to market, your inbound supply chain, I think is okay-ish, but still a concern. It's the outbound and markets. It's going to be about finding new markets. So I think this is probably more just from a personal opinion versus a professional opinion. But I think the worst you can do now is to knee-jerk and start shifting. I think you've also got to stay true to your values or whatever your organization is and wait for some of the dust to settle whilst looking for alternatives. And look, a very, very big agenda item in Africa is localization. Always has been, as is what's happening in the States. That's what they're pushing for. They want local manufacturing to come back. And that means there's a lot of pressure on our governments and whatever to reduce the cost of doing business here. So obviously that's also going to have to scale up around what the government guys decide and the powers that be. As a procurement professional, I think, having gut feel what's happening in markets, I think the more global footprint you have, the more fun you're going to have. So all I can say is we are literally trying to get a lot of opinion pieces. But what I have seen consistently is, look, it's just going to put localization even more up on the agenda. We actually have an event that we call Made in Africa. Made in Africa by Africa, BUY. So, I mean, if you think the size and scope of our continent and the resources on this continent, we should be able to be okay. And most of our technology and stuff is coming from, not from the States.
Yes, that is going to be an issue for the States, I would say, more
I'd
than
love whoever's going to watch this, and if they do, please put your comments. And it's literally something we're rallying around just to kind of assist our professionals on this. So we're putting on a lot of thought pieces. We have a huge conference in September that it'll be very much a hot item. But I also think by then we'll be a little bit more down the road to, and so the other thing as well, what you should be doing is a lot of scenario planning. So that was actually something I did think about. There are tools out there. There was a couple of organizations, I'm sure there's many around the world, but look for a company that does this. We actually had a company that was offering it completely free to organizations in South Africa during COVID. So I think, just don't knee jerk, and don't forget you might have unintended consequences if you move too quickly. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really good words of wisdom there. Keep it calm, but yeah, plan for all the different possibilities. So within Africa specifically, you wouldn't say that there's been any huge shift towards doing anything locally or nearshoring within the last couple weeks or months because that was already a topic.
We have, and I know when you and I met in person, we have legislation that has been pushing that. I think the question is around, there's not unlimited monies around localization. So what are we doing? So we even have something we call the Africa Free Trade Agreement. So there's been a lot of talk and unpacking about how does that practically happen, etc. This is not a new conversation for our continent. And sometimes you need a crisis to make it happen.
That's a very positive outlook. I like that. Yeah. Okay. Speaking of positivity, what sort of gives you the most optimism about kind of the future of procurement and how we're going through things currently?
So, look, something I've always enjoyed around procurement in our market is that we have such an important role around economic development. I spoke about that legislation, which is the BE codes, and that's directing spend. It's when a procurement person is sitting in their role, they have an opportunity to change the life of a small to medium sized business. In the government sectors, if you do it right and you're passionate about it and you're there for the right reasons, you change people's lives in the region that you look after. We actually host a wonderful event in the Western Cape in 2 months' time. And I'm just working, there's colleagues that have been in those positions. I've been working with them for 15 years in government, which, by the way, is not usual. Normally they move around a lot. But just such passion around the projects and the innovation and how, if they procure smartly, money goes further. They plan properly, you don't have service delivery interruptions. So for me, that has always been the positive. I think you cannot disconnect that whether you're in public sector or private sector. The others, and probably is not just because I was in France around sustainability. Again, when I talk about economic development, that is a leg within the sustainability agenda. But I think the fact that we can expand on that, we've probably been so focused there. How do we do things bigger around localization and nearshoring? But there's all these other elements. And I think for a procurement leader, it gives you something passionate. It gives you something that all organizations are talking from C-suite. So it gives you something to bring to the boardroom table, which is not just, hey, I saved money. So there's reputation management that's happening, but procurement's being put forward to say, okay, well, how are we doing this? Or what are we doing around, sustainable procurement, and what is your strategy? So I think that kind of makes your role a bit more exciting than all you talk about is savings. And I know that sounds very when I say that, but I still see articles that are like value over savings. I'm like, okay, yeah, but we keep saying the same thing. What is that value? And that's when sustainability hit my ears about 6 years ago. I sort of looked and went, okay, interesting, but there's nothing around. That's why, by the way, we even host the Sustainability Summit and work with a lot of international partners around bringing, again, case studies, use case, so that we can help our professionals find their way and their strategy for their organizations.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. So, but then kind of with all the topics, all the smaller topics that we're covering here with nearshoring, with the supply chain being localized, and with sustainability, these are all things that we can kind of keep an eye on through digital procurement. Yeah? Is that kind of where
Yeah,
you're
I
going
think
with this?
also 100%. I think one of the challenges you spoke about teams.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you think around procurement, your key stakeholder circle of influence is your supplier. There's no supplier, you're not procurement. You can't buy, there's no one to buy from. And I think, with reason, if you talk 5 years ago, if you had to ask suppliers to please go and register a new system, so, just the data in part from suppliers were very reluctant and behind the times. Where, again, COVID, thank you, and just the fact, hey, the world's moved online. And even if you don't have a laptop, you've got a phone, and people kind of understand that they want to do business, they have to be online and access to technology. So I think that part of e-procurement, whatever it is, vendor management systems, whatever, is now a lot easier because you're not struggling to get your suppliers just to do the basics.
If you're talking to procurement leaders, what are some things that you wish that they understood from the get-go about starting their digital transformation in order to make their lives easier, make your life easier?
I think you're spoiled for choice now. You might not be budget spoiled for choice, but what I have seen is ones that have extended the ERP system, those are not necessarily systems that are best of breed, what you're looking for, depending on what area of procurement your systems. I saw a wonderful article. I was trying to think of the terminology, but it was really kind of saying, like, how do you create your hybrid e-procurement solution? And that's what I do suggest. So really do your homework. Don't think, oh, let's just get, they promise us A to Z. There's very few platforms that can do everything. Also, don't promise all platforms that say we can integrate into anything. Your processes, obviously, and your data. So, data and cleaning of data and data integrity is always going to be so fundamental because it doesn't matter what system you have if your data is rubbish. So, I think there's those are important groundworks, review your processes and your systems and your policies, look at your data, and don't necessarily just go for okay, well, I don't want to name and shame it. We're already, with this company, our whole ERP system's there. Let's just take the plugins. There are a lot of solutions out there now. And what's also great is that they don't have to be based in your region. I think that's what's fantastic. Previously, honestly, and I don't know why, 6 years ago, you wouldn't necessarily take on an e-procurement solution, or plugin or whatever, if they didn't have support here. That support is also important. So can they support you in the time zones that you need to be supported? You don't want people sitting and waiting 24 hours or 12 hours or whatever, depending where the support team sits. But we're a global organization and global world now. So there's lots of choice there. And I think what's also great is that you don't, like I said previously, 10 years ago, there was one or two, and they were really big solutions, which were unaffordable to medium-sized businesses. So now you do have solutions, yeah.
You mentioned specifically support within the region being a factor. Is it mostly to do with time zones? Is it languages? Are there other factors that might steer someone to pick a company or pick a provider from a specific region?
Look, I think when you're going to onboard a complete digital transformation, you kind of feel more happy when there's someone you can pick up the phone. They're right here, they can come. Let's be honest, but it's not impossible. So, and it is a chicken and egg, because to set up an office and get going, you need some clients to make it worthwhile. So I think don't be hindered by that, but you need to know that you've got that quick call and quick answer, because no one can say any transformation process and changing of technology in their business has ever been seamless, because that's impossible. There's people involved, and we, starting from the data was generated by, let's call it, imperfection. So, a lot of that needs a bit of a tweaking, but it's also a great way to streamline your business and question how you do things, why do we do things, instead of just doing them because it's always been done like that.
When kind of moving into this new digital sort of procurement, obviously there's a lot of change management that needs to happen. What does good change management look like in practice?
Communication, communication, communication. I heard one of the suggestions in one of the case studies that, just you can't implement from the top down. You need to engage your team from the bottom up. And even if you're just kind of doing work groups, I know we're always too busy to have times like that, but you've got to do that groundwork. and then nominate those people that love change and are good and have multiple representatives of those across the team and the business. And look, at the end of the day, we know that a key skill and successful heads of procurement and CPOs is because they're great communicators and they can draw the picture and the vision, which then, people are open to follow how the fact that the system and the login looks different, etc. So I'm sure CPOs might say some other more strategic things, but that would be my advice on the side.
To further dig into that, though, so you said that communication is the biggest skill. Excellent. That's great. I agree from my knowledge point. But would you say there are other skills, especially soft skills, that are maybe missing or harder to find within the procurement teams that could, yeah, that could help with the digital transformation or also just help procurement?
When I talk communication, you also got to think about style. You've got to think about the leadership. I think also if you're at a C-suite level, which a CPO should be, you are very much a leader and shouldn't be a processor. So you can't take things forward if you're sort of getting pulled down into the day-to-day doing. I think, in fact, there's this amazing head of procurement that works for a very big retailer and has now been, what's the word, taken across to another country. But anyone that I met in her team could not stop saying what an amazing leader she was. And everyone in her team just grew. And her position within a global organization was pushed up because she could paint the picture. She could tell the story. So, and I know it sounds a bit stupid and like so simple, but if she did a PowerPoint presentation to the board, it was straight to the point to keep it simple. It wasn't death by numbers. And I think we don't all naturally have that because it takes a very expert storyteller to keep a message simple and keep it factual. And if there's ways to learn how to do that better, that's when you get the seat at the boardroom table, when you can present your value in a way that they will absorb it. I think if anyone's been stuck in that, someone starts looking at how things are going in the business, we sort of drown them in facts, but that doesn't get their buy-in. That just puts everyone on the back foot. Is it naturally there? Don't know, but I think also, wonderful presentation I heard a few years ago is we can't keep blaming for our seats at the boardroom table. Just go ahead and build the relationships. And you, as a head of procurement, you're not just in a silo. You're with so many business stakeholders, but you can't reactively work with them. It's the ones that work proactively to be involved in project scoping and demand planning. That's when the issues down the line get minimized. But if all you're trying to do is, oh, well, they didn't call us in, so no wonder they're late, then it's not going to work.
We've talked a lot about kind of bigger global companies and governments and things. How do you see what you've kind of recommended changing for smaller or mid-sized organizations, especially in the approach to digitalization or also in how a leader needs to lead?
So resource is always the problem in mid-tier size companies or small. But there is a lot of free technology. We have AI. My advice always is start somewhere, how to eat the elephant, etc. So don't think, okay, I'm never going to afford the whole ERP system and the end-to-end. Just, choose one area in your procurement process and when you're always strapped for resource, what do? Well, can I hire another person? I can't afford them. Can technology do this? Possibly, definitely. So, as a small business, you should be more importantly looking at technology because a resource is the most, a person, a warm body is the most expensive resource. But start it somewhere, and that's how technology develops. So choose contract management, choose vendor management, move away from the all I do is invoicing. And sometimes I think we also there's a jump when you're a very small business to when you start becoming a little bit more sizable, but you're still operating as a small business. So you're not implementing procurement practices. You're still on 3 quotes, but you've kind of forgotten that your spend is jumped. And that's an interesting place to be as an organization. So we're very involved in small business development within this market. And in all these development programs and business incubators that run in this market, none of them cover supply chain. They don't teach a small business what is the basics of supply chain. And that almost fundamentally seems like an issue. So that's something that we work with a couple of bodies to see how you can involve small business, because they also don't think, oh, there's actually a better way and a more planned way that I should be doing this.
Would you say kind of it needs to start at the smaller level, kind of getting those processes in, or is it up here where they need to start with one or two areas?
Somewhere in between. It's invest in that. And look, if you are an export import company, invest in your supply chain, in someone with expertise, because chances are it's probably the person who was the accountant and the marketing manager has now been doing your supply chain for the last 10 years. But we have very little wiggle room now for error with what's going on. And I think honestly, if businesses invest in that kind of expertise, with the fact that there's so much technology out there, it can only help.
Excellent. Good answer to a shady question.
A little bit of I'm used to shady questions.
Good. Yeah. To be honest, I think those are a lot of the questions that I really wanted to ask. Do you feel like there's something that I haven't asked that you have an opinion on that you want to touch on?
We've been doing like an e-procurement survey, part of a marketing tool initially, and then with the partner that we did, where they said, look, we want this to be more robust, they were on board with that. So we expanded it to look a lot at maturity of procurement departments in South Africa. But last year we actually launched a KPI element to the tool. So the results we got is what we expected. I think almost 40% of the respondents are not measuring most of those KPIs. There was nothing, which blew my mind, there's nothing external in the South African market, not even in Africa, that truly says if I, as a bank, want to compare myself with the other banks, where do I sit? And the reason we pushed for it is because so often I was getting calls to say, hey, do you know of like a benchmarking survey or KPI? And it doesn't even sit within some of the big consultancies based here. So yep, we launched that last year, and the intent is that how do you put a business case at the boardroom table to the CEO if you're not measuring the basic things? And part of this questionnaire and benchmarking survey is to get people to start thinking about what they should be benchmarking. So it's only year one, and the results were pretty awful, but we expected it. The fact that they are not measuring was what we expected. I'm looking forward to kind of seeing this year as well. We also obviously are expanding the respondents, and we've agreed to hone in some industries, which I think will be helpful. But yeah, I mean, the fact that there's no research that's released every year from whether it's a procurement body or an industry body around these kind of typical KPIs for procurement supply chain tells you something. So I think in that way we've got a long way to go. I don't know if there are ones. I know there is one or two global that we definitely reviewed when we were putting our questions together. But that's something that we're also very focused on as well.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I don't know that you're finding that out and that you're doing the research.
Well, and it's the theme of this discussion. It's not being measured because you're not using the technology. So if you were using technology, you would have a lot of those numbers and figures and those ratios and calculations at, the tip of your fingers. Yeah.
Definitely. All right. Well, honestly, thank you very, very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I don't quote me on everything, but yeah, it was a really great chat. Lots happening at the moment. Lots happening at the moment in the world, so for us to look at.